Hey everyone, this is Wild and Woolly Gaming coming to you with a brand new album today. I am so very excited because Queens of the Stone Age are one of my favorite bands. They always have been, and it's their first album since Like Clockwork, which by itself was a masterpiece. So here it is. I actually got it yesterday, a day before the album was supposed to be released. I guess they decided to deliver it to my house a day early because I'm such a great fan. Um, but the actual, the one I'm more excited about, the deluxe bundle that I got, isn't even here today. What the heck, guys? Anyways, I'm here to do a review for the album. It's a heck of an album. It's very, very different from their last album, and let's get going. So, I mean, the initial thing that I think a lot of people kind of noticed with this album is Mark Ronson. People heard Mark Ronson, Mark Ronson, Mark Ronson, Mark Ronson, and as soon as they hear about Mark Ronson, they think Uptown Funk, they think pop producer, they think this guy's going to ruin Queens of the Stone Age. And honestly, I think that couldn't be farther from the truth. I think he injected kind of a freshness. He was what Hami wanted. He wanted more of a dance sort of groove, and he's been kind of into dance grooves since, at very least, the era Vulgaris, Misfit Love and songs like that. You can even go back to Lullabies and even prior to that, where it's just very dance heavy sort of numbers. But he really expands upon it this album, and The Way You Used To was kind of the first experience most people had with this album, and it was very lackluster for a lot of people. Might be an easy way to say it. I thought it was a good album or a good song. First time I heard it, I was iffy about it, but it's definitely a grower. But that being said, the entirety of the album, there's a large amount of tempo shifts in it, and there's really a lot of beat changes all throughout the album. For me, this album is really about having fun, and really ever since Era Vulgaris, especially with them Crooked Vultures, like I said, Hami's really gotten more into dancing and just that sort of a groove. And Michael Schumann's been a very big part of that. But he's also maintained a kind of a dark, nitty gritty, arrogant attitude towards his lyrics, as evidenced by this album. As well as the instrumentations, they're still very dark. This, in my opinion, is the tightest of every Queen's album thus far. There's not a single note that is out of place. I think this is partially due to Mark Ronson's influence, but I really think it's also partially the band being very comfortable together and writing together. I mean, Mikey Shoes cut his teeth in Queens of the Stone Age, more or less. And, this is Hami's first real artist that he could shape from basically the beginning of his major career onwards. Every other artist kind of came in and left after they already had a somewhat established career. And I think Mikey Shoes is really a great basis for this band, partially because of that. Lyrically speaking, this is probably their most complex album. They seem to forego rhyming in many instances, and just to properly express a thought, which it sounds kind of odd, but rather than make it witty, they would rather, as I said, kind of forego the whole rhyming, and it sounds odd on the first take, and I think part of this is influenced by Hami's time in Iggy Pop's project, the Post Pop Depression, because there's not a ton of rhyming in that. It's more spoken word, and I think Hami kind of took from that a little bit. The instrumentals and the vocals in many songs, including in Un-Reborn again and Hideaway, they seem to kind of mesh and swirl together. If you've ever seen Led Zeppelin live, for example, a good example of this might be Dazed and Confused off of their 1973 Madison Square Garden performance on The Song Remains the Same. Dazed and Confused, guitar and vocals kind of mesh together. They respond to each other, and I think it's a lot of that in this album. Now going to the band members, Troy Van Leeuwen and Dean Fertitta, they're really the unsung heroes of this album. With their instruments, especially with synthesizers and a lot of the specialty instruments that Triz, I guess Troy Van Leeuwen, that he uses, really gives this album an atmosphere, more so than even Like Clockwork. They make the entire album feel as though it's been recorded inside of a haunted mansion, with ghosts actually joining in the recording. It's a very haunting presence that they give it. Now back to Mikey Shoes. Like I said, he's really stepping into his role, even more so than on Like Clockwork. He's got a very solid groove on a very large portion of the album. The bass is really cranked up high, and a lot of people I heard, there's a lot of people who still get antsy about it. But Nick Oliveri's been out of the band for 15 years, guys. Get over it. Get over it. He was a great bassist, he was awesome, band member, I would assume. I mean, despite the bad things he did, musically he was very good in the band, but just get over it. I don't want to hear Songs for the Deaf 5 times in a row. I don't want to hear, I want to hear it 5 times in a row. I just don't want to hear a new album and be like, this is Songs for the Deaf Part 4, it'd be awesome to kind of hear a different take on it, but Queens are not that band, and I think Mikey Shoes is actually a very big part of that evolution, especially being that he's the youngest member of the band. Now, Jon Theodore, he's the most technical drummer, and this is really his first full experience with the band, especially being that he only was able to drum on one studio song with Queens, and that was on their last album. It was the title track to the album. It was Like Clockwork, and he did an okay job, he did a good job, but the song was just so subdued that you can't expect a drummer of his talent to really show off too much in it. And I think in this album, he shows how good he can be, not so much with his power, sadly. I think part of that's due to Ronson, but much more so with his technicality. The man sounds like a drumming machine, and there's so many songs where it's just instant, you'd have to listen to it to know exactly what I mean, but he just hits every single note perfectly and doesn't leave a single note ringing, doesn't do whatever, it's perfect. Hami's still very much present in this album, but he lets this band really shine in it, and I think part of that's also due to Iggy Pop. He was a backing member of that band. I saw them live, which was awesome. It was actually one of the best concerts I've ever been to, and Hami seemed so happy being just a member of the band, not being the centerpiece of the band, but just being a dude who could dance and do backing vocals and play guitar. He seemed so happy doing it. And I think that kind of had an impact on this. He's given the other members of the band more freedom to kind of make their own creative decisions. And he's still a very big part of it, still the biggest part of it, but he's almost a member of the band now. Obviously still the centerpiece, but just the member. And kind of going back to Mark Ronson, he's been praised and derided for this album. I find it's more refreshing than anything. For me, I really think that The Way You Used To, being that it's their first single, is also, even though it's their most heavily produced album or song on the album by far, if you listen to it in the midsection of it, it kind of goes back to that old robot rock style that you would have in early Queens, especially the first album. It's just like this really solid groove. I think around the 2 minute 30-second mark. It's just such a good song. Now, going to Feet Don't Fail Me, it's the opener on this song, on this album. First minute and a half are just a very slow build-up. Kind of like, what's the song? It's kind of like Keep Your Eyes Peeled off of Like Clockwork. It builds slowly. I mean, much more slowly than that, even. And then it hits like Millionaire plus Misfit Love. And I honestly think it's probably their best opener since Millionaire. It's just such a strong song. They did such a good job with it. And it's a song like that reminds you that Queens are really still here to stay. And that they haven't really lost a step. I've already spoken about The Way You Used To. But going on to Domesticated Animals, that's another song I feel like is very heavily influenced by Iggy Pop. It feels as though it could have been on Post Pop Depression. It's a great song, but I feel as though it's the weakest song on the album. It's a great song on its own, don't get me wrong, but it just kind of feels out of sync with the remainder of the album. I mean, I can understand why they put it there, but it's just for the rest of the album, I feel like there's stronger songs. It's a great song still. I mean, I give it like a B or a B plus, just by itself, but just being that the whole album is kind of thematic, in a haunted / dance party way, a haunted dance party, really, it almost kind of feels out of place. Fortress, I would say, is a very somber tune, at least in the beginning, and it really is one of Hami's most vulnerable expressions he's ever had. It's kind of a repetitive song, probably the most repetitive on the album, but I feel like it's still very strong. And to go with the theme, it's got a very haunting feeling, especially because of Fertitta and Van Leeuwen. Using the synths and whatever other instruments they have. I can't really pinpoint them that well, but I could, maybe there's a slide guitar in there. It's just very, very, haunting. The bass, very much like the rest of the album, is a very good strong point, and the riff on it, it's kind of not a usual riff. The entire album has pretty strong riffage, as you could expect, but Hami is very well known for his odd guitar tones. This song has a pretty conventional guitar tone, at least towards the end on the riff, and it's different. When you're so used to being out of the norm, having something that's normal is different, and I feel like that's kind of what this song is about. Now, Head Like a Haunted House is probably their most raw song, and it's got tons of energy, and it's really packed into a song that's just over 3 minutes, and it all kind of sounds punky. I try to avoid saying this song sounds like, this or that, especially with a band that's always evolving, but it kind of reminds me a bit of Battery Acid from Aero Vulgaris, and uses kind of some supporting vocals that answer Hami's lyrics, to which he actually responds in kind. It kind of reminds me of, and I know I said I don't like doing this, but it kind of reminds me of Aero Vulgaris meets Death by Sexy by Eagles of Death Metal, and it's really just an odd tune, but it actually fits with the flow of the album, and it's the fastest song and also the shortest by far. I mean, there's only 9 songs on the album, but I believe almost every song is over 5 minutes long, which is very cool. Very cool. Un-Reborn, again, this one's kind of another odd one. I mean, most of the songs on this album are kind of odd, but it almost kind of reminds me, the intro vocals of it, after about 30 or 40 seconds, I think they start, it almost kind of reminds me of Liar by the Sex Pistols, his vocals, and it's very strange, but it works very well, and it's got like a solid groove, especially around the middle part of the song. And this is a perfect song, I would say, for to kind of really dissect how Queens are. They have definite intros, midpoints, and endpoints in all their songs. And oftentimes, especially in this album, they've got a lot of intros and outros that kind of merge together, which also brings together the album as a very cohesive sound. And I think this song is, again, it's kind of a microcosm of all that. It's got a very distinct first part, a very distinct mid part, and the outro is completely different, but it all fits together. And in many parts of the song, especially towards the end, Josh kind of uses his voice as an instrument. And starting around a minute 40 or a minute 30 seconds left in the song, it almost kind of sounds like Seal's Kissed by a Rose. And it just kind of merges into a calamity almost, but it shows that a calamity of instruments. And it shows that Josh's mastery of commanding, numerous very different sounding instruments still is great. If you've ever heard, I think I Lost My Headache. If you've ever heard that song, the ending of that is just very, kind of abrasive to some people, same with You Can't Quit Me, Baby, but this feels like a very refined version of that, and I love it. The Evil Has Landed is the second solo that's come out from this album, and I honestly feel like it's one of the strongest songs they've ever released. It's really good, and this is probably the wittiest song on the album. It's a very impressive song. It's got numerous guitar solos. It's very polished, and the outro is extremely driving. I mean, the outro could have fit, if it was produced differently on Songs for the Deaf. Excellent, excellent song. Villains of Circumstance, it's the last song on the album, but I also feel like it's probably the closest song on this album to any other song on another album, specifically Like Clockwork, the title track from that album. And it's just, it's a very haunting song, and once Hami hits, like, certain parts of the song, it just blows up into it's a beautiful change, and it's just how he says, for the listener to close their eyes and to dream him home. It's just the way he does it. It's very Hami-esque, and obviously, it's not like a lot of their old heavier stuff, but it very much reminds me of Like Clockwork, and how it's an evolving style. And he actually said himself he wanted a more up-tempo album that was a little bit less depressing or a little bit less down compared to Like Clockwork, and he achieves it in spades here. And I really think that this album, despite my extremely long review of it here, when I first heard it, I was like, but it's a grower, and I got to give this album a solid, I was going to say a B+. Initially, like yesterday and going to this morning when I'd heard it one or two times, but now that I've heard it a few more times than that, I got to give it an A-. It's not their strongest effort. It's, for me, it's not quite as good as Like Clockwork, not quite as good as, Rated R or like Songs for the Deaf, and maybe even their first album, but I really feel like it's a strong effort, and it's very different from a lot of the other stuff they've done. And I think that in many ways, this is exactly what Hami wanted. He wanted a more dance rock oriented outfit that was heavier than Eagles of Death Metal, but also nothing that's just too abrasive or too heavy. And he seemed to have achieved it. I mean, the only somewhat weak-ish song that kind of feels like filler, again, would be Domesticated Animals, but not even really. It doesn't feel like there's much filler on this album. Everything just blends together so perfectly. So, tell me what you guys think. Again, sorry for the long review, but I had a lot to say about this, especially being that Queens are my favorite band. But yeah, just tell me what you think. I'd love to hear your opinion on this album. And tell me, if you got the bundles. I want to see exactly what sort of quality they are, especially being that mine's not even in the house yet. It's not been delivered. It's unfair, but like, subscribe, comment on my Celine Dion shirt, do whatever you want. Hope that you guys watch more of my videos, and enjoy the album, guys.